So, what's the right thing to do? It's a question that sounds so simple, but the answers, well, they're anything but. And one of the most influential and, let's be honest, controversial ways to tackle that question starts with a scenario you've almost certainly heard before.
Yeah, you know the one. It's the classic trolley problem. A runaway trolley is hurtling down the tracks, headed straight for 5 people who are tied up. But you're standing next to a lever. If you pull it, you can divert the trolley to a different track. But there's one person tied up there. So, what do you do?
These kinds of gut-wrenching, impossible choices where you're forced to weigh lives and outcomes are exactly what utilitarianism was designed to help us navigate. It's a philosophy built for the real world's messy, complicated problems. At its heart is this one simple idea, the principle of utility. The idea is to forget about abstract rules or divine commands for just a moment. For utilitarians, morality is all about making the world as happy as possible. The goal is simple: maximize pleasure and minimize pain. But of course, that's way easier said than done. How can you actually calculate which action is going to lead to the most happiness?
Well, that brings us to our first major thinker, the English philosopher and social reformer Jeremy Bentham. He had this wild idea. He wanted to turn morality into a kind of science.
And back in the 18th and 19th centuries, this was a totally radical idea. Bentham basically said, look, the point of morality isn't pleasing some god or following a dusty old rulebook. It's about the happiness of living beings in this world. And that's it. The goal is just more pleasure, less pain. So how do you measure it? Bentham called it the hedonic calculus, which is just a fancy name for a 7-point checklist to measure pleasure. You'd weigh things like how strong it is, how long it'll last, and how sure you are it'll happen. You'd also consider if it might lead to more pleasure down the line, and whether it's pure or if it's going to be followed by pain. And then, the big one, the most important factor, its extent. How many people is this actually going to affect? So let's see how this actually works. Imagine you're deciding whether to tell a friend a painful truth or a comforting lie. The lie might produce some intense, certain pleasure in the short term, but the truth, while it's painful right now, has what Bentham would call high fecundity. It leads to more pleasure in the future, in the form of trust and a stronger friendship. A strict Benthamite would have to weigh all these factors to make a decision.
Now, this approach, which is known as act utilitarianism, leads to some pretty troubling questions, right? It seems to just ignore fundamental things like justice or individual rights. I mean, if sacrificing one person truly creates more total happiness, does this calculus say we should just do it? This is the huge problem that our next thinker tried to solve.
And that brings us to John Stuart Mill. Now, Mill was a follower of Bentham, but he saw the deep flaws in a purely numbers-based approach to happiness, and he really wanted to refine the theory.
Mill proposed what we now call rule utilitarianism. So instead of judging every single act by itself, he said we should focus on general rules. The question isn't, will this specific lie create more happiness right now? The question is, what if everyone lived by the rule, lie whenever it's convenient? Well, that would lead to a pretty miserable world. So he argued we should follow the rules that generally promote the most happiness. But Mill's second big idea was maybe even more profound. He argued that Bentham's whole calculus was missing a critical point. Not all pleasures are created equal. Some are just better than others. This is his most famous line on the subject. A pig can be perfectly satisfied rolling in the mud, but a human can experience the joy of art, philosophy, and deep relationships. Mill believed these higher pleasures were just fundamentally more valuable, even if they sometimes come with a little dissatisfaction. He separated pleasures into these two categories. You've got the lower pleasures, the ones we share with other animals, like eating and drinking. And then you have the higher pleasures, which engage our minds and our uniquely human abilities. For Mill, a society that prioritizes these higher pleasures will be a happier and just a better society in the long run. So you can see how Mill's rule utilitarianism gives us a way out of some of Bentham's more troubling conclusions. A rule that protects individual rights, for example, is justified because a society that respects rights is, overall, a much happier and more secure place to live than one that doesn't. Okay, so we've got two frameworks, Bentham's act-based math and Mill's rule-based system that values quality over quantity. So how do they hold up when we apply them to some of today's complex issues? Let's take digital privacy. This is a perfect utilitarian trade-off, right? The security and happiness of the many versus the privacy and autonomy of the individual.
A strict act utilitarian, like Bentham, might look at just a single case. If collecting everyone's data stops one major terrorist attack, the pleasure of safety for millions might just outweigh the pain of lost privacy for everyone. It's a simple calculation. But a rule utilitarian, like Mill, would ask, what's the best general rule? And a rule allowing constant surveillance could create a society of fear and distrust, which would ultimately reduce overall happiness.
You see this same tension with environmental policy. An act utilitarian might argue for prioritizing economic growth right now because the pleasure of prosperity is immediate and certain. But a rule utilitarian would ask, what's the best long-term rule for humanity? A rule of sustainability would protect the well-being of future generations, forcing us to expand our moral math across time.
Both approaches, though, still seem to bring us back to this one fundamental challenge. Utilitarianism, in its purest form, says that happiness is the only thing that has real intrinsic value. But is that right? What if a perfectly happy society was built on a terrible injustice?
And this really gets to the heart of it all. The theory forces us to define what we even mean by happiness, and maybe more importantly, whose happiness we should be considering in the first place.
And what's really interesting is that this powerful idea comes from Bentham himself. He argued that if a being can suffer, its suffering has to be included in our moral calculus. He was one of the first major Western philosophers to argue that the suffering of non-human animals actually matters. It's a radical extension of the moral community. Think about your own life. We use utilitarian reasoning all the time, often without even thinking about it. We might tell a white lie to spare someone's feelings, or support a policy that benefits the majority, even if it has some downsides. The logic of the greater good is deeply, deeply intuitive. And that brings us right back to the theory's biggest tension. In its relentless focus on the total sum of happiness, does utilitarianism risk becoming blind to the rights and the dignity of the individual? In the end, utilitarianism gives us a powerful lens. It forces us to look beyond just ourselves and consider the consequences for everyone. But it also leaves us with the most profound questions. What kind of happiness should we be chasing? And what do we do when the greatest good for the greatest number demands a price from the few?